Okay, chapter 16, the last chapter we are going to cover in this book. We made it. Feel very proud of yourself for getting through all of these recordings. Chapter 16 is going to look at the various disorders that we talked about in chapter 15, and it's going to talk about how we treat those disorders, the various treatments. So there are cognitive treatments, there are behavior treatments, there are biomedical treatments that we're going to talk about. There are 3 modules in this chapter. The first one is going to look at various approaches that we use for the treatments. And then the second one is going to, module 50 is going to look at a different group of approaches and the treatments. And then module 51 is going to yet look at yet another different type of approach for the treatments of the psychological disorders. Okay, so let's start with module 49. And, I thought I had a different. Well, I wanted to talk about the treatment. No, I guess this is right. I thought it was going to talk about the treatment. I thought I'm just going to give you I thought there was something that talked about the treatment of the psychological disorders. But let's just continue on. Maybe I switched something up. I won't mess it up. Okay, sorry about that. Psychotherapy, and we're going to talk about the psychodynamic, the behavioral, and the cognitive approaches as treatment for various disorders. So this is the first type of approach. This is the psychotherapy approach, which looks at psychodynamic, again, behavioral and cognitive approaches. And there are 2 questions we are going to answer in this module. The first one is, what are the goals of psychologically based and biologically based treatment approaches? So these are 2 different approaches, right? The psychologically based and then the biologically based. So what are the goals of each of those? And then the second question is, what are the psychodynamic, behavioral, and cognitive approaches to actual treatment for someone with a certain disorder? Okay, so the first thing that we're going to talk about is psychotherapy. Psychotherapy. Now, it says, all psychological approaches, regardless whether it's the approach we're going to talk about in this module or 50 or 51, but all of the psychological approaches to therapy, they seek to solve some sort of psychological problem, right? The person has a psychological problem, they have a psychological disorder, and all of the approaches seek to solve that. And they're going to do it by modifying people's behavior and helping them obtain a better understanding of themselves. Those people who provide therapy, they vary considerably in their educational background and in their training. So you may have a counselor, you may have a therapist, a social worker, a clinical psychologist, a psychiatrist, whoever it is, right? But they all differ in their training and in their educational background. Many of the people who treat individuals with disorders have doctoral degrees in psychology. Therapy is also provided by people in fields that are allied with psychology, such as psychiatrists and social workers. So there are a plethora of different individuals that actually treat people with psychological disorders. It really depends on the kind of problem, and that there are certain types of therapists that may be more appropriate in treating a disorder than others may be. It really is individualized depending on what the psychological disorder is. So let's start out with the psychodynamic approaches to therapy. Anytime you hear this word psychodynamic or psychoanalysis in psychology, the first person that should come to your mind should be Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is synonymous with psychodynamic and psychoanalysis. So when we talk about the psychodynamic therapy, it seeks to bring unresolved past conflicts and these unacceptable impulses from the unconscious to the conscious. So that way the person can deal with those issues effectively. This psychodynamic approach is based on Freud's psychoanalytic approach to personality. And what we got from Freud is that people employ these defense mechanisms that they put up. And those are psychological strategies to protect an individual from unacceptable unconscious impulses. So if there is something so stressful that you don't want to deal with, or if there's something so problematic or traumatic, an individual will have these defense mechanisms in place so that they don't have these unconscious impulses that come to the present. We also have, when we talk about psychodynamic theory, repression, and we have mentioned repression previously. It is when something is so traumatic that you have gone through, and as a way to preserve yourself and move on past it, your mind will actually repress those memories. It'll put that information into the unconscious so that you are not even aware of it. Now, since we have talked about Freud, right? I've mentioned Freud and psychoanalysis. I think it's only appropriate that we talk a little bit about Freud's therapy. Now, as much as Freud was kind of crazy and out there, because he was pretty crazy, right? He was pretty unusual in his therapeutic techniques. However, a lot of the information and the techniques that he used, we use somewhat today in our current therapeutic techniques. So first, let's just give a definition for psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is Freud's form of psychotherapy. So the goal was to release hidden unconscious thoughts and feelings in order to reduce their power in controlling our behavior. So Freud believed that we have all of this unwanted information in our unconscious that perhaps we had repressed. And Freud thought that if we bring it into the present from the unconscious to the conscious, then it will actually reduce its power over us and that we can move on past it. So we have 4 different types of information with, well, actually 2, and then 2 of them are part of the third one. That'll make sense in just a minute. But one is free association. This is where patients, say aloud whatever comes to mind. And the therapist attempts to identify the connections to the patient's unconscious. So you would just go in and you would talk to the therapist and you would just freely talk about whatever at all. The therapist is trained in identifying certain things in what you are talking about. And perhaps then Freud would take this back to information in the unconscious. That is what free association is also about. Now, a second big part of Freud's psychoanalytic therapy was dream interpretation. And it involves examining dreams to find clues to the unconscious conflicts and problems. And so Freud would ask patients to talk about their dreams. And based on what they were saying, Freud would kind of try and tie that into something that was in the individual's unconscious. And we have 2 different types of information we can get from dream interpretation. One is the manifest content and one is the latent content. So the difference between the 2 of those. The manifest content is the surface description of a dream. So you dreamt about a dog chasing you. The manifest content was there was a dog chasing you. The latent content, that's the underlying meaning. So you dream about a dog chasing you, but Freud would say, well, perhaps this is really talking about some conflict that you have with your mother or father, and you feel as though they're always after you. to do this or that, right? So the manifest content is what is on the surface. The latent content is if you dig a little bit deeper, that's what the dream really means. We also have in Freud's therapy resistance and transference. So first off, resistance is the inability or unwillingness to reveal particular memories, thoughts, or motivations. So as Freud was trying to dig deeper into the patient's problem, they would resist that. They did not want to talk about what was happening. So there was some resistance to that type of therapy. And we still see this today in a lot of therapy sessions. There's also this therapeutic concept called transference. And this is where you have the transfer of feelings to a psychoanalyst of love or anger that had been originally directed to someone else. And in Freud's case, he always took it back to the parents or some sort of authority figure. So you would take the feeling you had towards your parents and you would transfer that onto the therapist. Now, transference can be used to help a patient recreate a past relationship that was psychologically difficult and work their way through that. Now, these various psychoanalytic therapeutic techniques that Freud used, again, remember, we don't use so many of these today so much, but we do, however, have some contemporary psychodynamic approaches. So that's what I want to talk about here is the contemporary psychodynamic approaches we have towards therapeutic treatment. There is no conclusive evidence that shows that psychoanalysis works better than other, more recent forms of therapy. It's not saying that that was better than this. There is no evidence to show that. Today, more recently, psychodynamic therapists take a more active role in getting the patient to come out and say information and advising the patient on what to do. So Freud would kind of sit back and talk and listen, but the therapist in today's approach with psychodynamic approaches, they're going to take a more active role and they're going to kind of prod the patient into delving deeper and bringing out more information. Also today, they put less emphasis on the patient's past history and they concentrate instead on current relationships and specific complaints. They try to look away from the past and really focus more on the present. And this is what is happening today. So how are we going to move on from that? Let's take a look at evaluating psychodynamic therapy. In its longer versions, it can be time-consuming and quite expensive. And less articulate patients may not do as well. It's going to involve a lot of talking and working through things. So if you're not particularly articulate, you're going to have trouble doing that. It is also difficult to establish whether a patient has improved after psychodynamic therapy. So critics have questioned the entire theoretical basis behind psychodynamic therapy. Whenever you look at constructs such as the unconscious, right? The unconscious is a big part of psychodynamic therapy. You really cannot do scientific research on the unconscious. It is not something concrete because it's there in your unconscious. You're not even aware of it. So there's nothing to scientifically confirm that. So these four look very negative towards the psychodynamic therapy. However, For some people, it does provide solutions to difficult issues, and it can be effective. It does permit some sort of insight into the individual's life. So while it may be not so scientific and so much upheld in the therapeutic treatment community, for some people it does work really well. Okay, let's move away from psychodynamic therapy approach and let's move on to the behavioral approaches to therapy. Whenever we talk about behavioral treatment, you're going to make use of the basic principles of learning, such as reinforcement and extinction. And you're going to use those to eliminate the maladaptive behaviors that you have with this disorder. So if you remember back to our chapter on learning, we talked about reinforcement and punishment. We talked about with classical conditioning. We talked about extinction. So those are what the behavioral approach to therapy is going to look at. And so it's based on the fundamental assumption that both abnormal behavior and normal behavior is learned behavior. So if you learned it, you can unlearn it, right? Through extinction. That's what we're talking about. If you learned this maladaptive behavior, you can unlearn the maladaptive behavior. So the goal with behavioral therapy is to change a person's behavior in order to allow them to function more effectively. So let's start out looking at the classical conditioning treatments, right? So there's classical conditioning and operant conditioning. We're going to start out with the classical conditioning treatments. And we have two different types of treatments we're looking at. The first is what is called aversive conditioning. Aversive conditioning is a type of therapy that reduces the frequency of those undesired behaviors. And it does this by pairing it with some sort of aversive, unpleasant stimulus. So you have these undesirable behaviors that you have, which are not good. If you pair those bad behaviors with something that is aversive or unpleasant, you're less likely to do them because you don't want to be in an aversive or unpleasant situation. So if you make a pairing between the two, like with the CS and the US, you're less likely to do those behaviors. We also have what's called systematic desensitization. This is based on classical conditioning, and it's where exposure to an anxiety-producing stimulus is paired with deep relaxation in order to extinguish the anxiety. So you do this hierarchy of fears. You construct this hierarchy of fears, and you're going to work your way up through that hierarchy until you are no longer afraid of the situation. Let's say that you are afraid of dogs. Well, it would not be helpful to put you in with dogs immediately. That is flooding, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. But you would take very small baby steps, working your way up to the point where you're actually in the presence of another dog. That's systematic desensitization. You could also use virtual reality exposure therapy. Virtual reality, which you may be familiar with, right? If you put on virtual reality goggles, it puts you into a new situation or a new environment. And so it's a very safe way to be exposed to that stimulus that is so frightening to you. But again, you would do this in very small steps. So this is figure 2, and you can find this in your textbook on page 538. And it shows you the 8 steps that are involved, in order to reach the state of relaxation. You're supposed to follow these steps twice a day. And it's pretty much like what you would imagine with meditation. It's kind of the same thing you're doing. So this may seem familiar with meditation and yoga. It is very, very similar, but you want to reach this deep state of relaxation to the point where you are able to deal with that aversive stimulus. There's also, they talk about on the bottom of page 539, they show this picture of someone using virtual reality also. Now, let's talk about various classical conditioning treatments. The first one I had previously mentioned, and that is flooding. This is the opposite of systematic desensitization. Flooding is a behavioral treatment for anxiety in which the person is suddenly confronted with a stimulus that they fear. Right up front, right in your face, this is the stimulus. So in flooding, there is no relaxation training involved. The goal with flooding is to allow maladaptive responses of anxiety or avoidance to become extinct. It's right in your face, you realize nothing happened, and now it's gone. That fear should be gone. Now, flooding is not used as often as systematic desensitization or relaxation. It can be quite dangerous to the person, so it's not used as often. Most therapists would use the deep relaxation or the systematic desensitization over the flooding. Okay, so those are the classical conditioning treatments. I now want to move on to the operant conditioning techniques. And these approaches are based on the notion that desirable behavior should be rewarded and undesirable behavior should be either extinguished or punished, right? Extinguished or ignored or punished. So when someone does a good behavior, you want to reward them. When they do the undesirable behavior, you want to ignore them or you want to punish them. Right? Because that's what operant conditioning is all about. It's all about rewards and punishments. One type of operant conditioning technique is called a token system, sometimes also called token economies. And what you're doing is you're getting a token, such as a poker chip or something like that, every time you do a good behavior. And then when you've collected so many tokens, you get rewarded with extra phone time, extra privileges, things like that. But you're being rewarded for that good behavior. There's also contingency contracting. And this is where the therapist and the client write up this written agreement or this contract. And in that contract, it specifies behavioral goals and consequences that are going to occur. The therapist may also use observational learning, where they teach people ways of handling their fears. Now, just like we did where we evaluated psychodynamic therapy, we're also going to evaluate behavior therapy. We're going to talk about some of the benefits and some of the criticisms that go along with that. So first off, let's talk about the benefits to using behavior therapy as a technique for helping someone with their behaviors that go along with a disorder. So the first thing is that it eliminates anxiety disorders. Behavior therapy is very effective in eliminating the anxiety disorders. It has been used to treat phobias and compulsions that you see like with OCD disorder. obsessive compulsive disorder. It establishes control over your impulses. You have control of them now. They do not have control of you. And then the fourth benefit is that it helps in learning complex social skills in order to replace that maladaptive behavior. The one criticism we have with behavior therapy is that the insight into thoughts and expectations cannot be gained due to the changing external behavior. So you may not be able to get any insight into why someone is doing what they're doing. You are just focused on changing the behavior. The third type of approach we have is the cognitive approach to therapy. So we talked about the psychodynamic approach. We talked about the behavior approach. The third approach is the cognitive approach. And this teaches people to think in more adaptive ways. And they're going to do this by changing their dysfunctional thoughts about the world and themselves. This is sometimes referred to as CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, because it incorporates the basic principles of learning to change the way that people think. So it's taking the learning aspect and the cognitive aspect, and it's going to change your thought patterns. So what the therapists do is they teach clients to challenge their assumptions and adopt a new approach to their problems. The well-known psychologist that came up with this cognitive approach, so to speak, is Albert Ellis. And he suggested what he called an ABC model of negative activating conditions. So Albert Ellis's ABC model. What we know is that people harbor or keep these irrational, unrealistic ideas. These irrational, unrealistic ideas then can trigger negative emotions. And then it is those negative emotions that then support the irrational belief and lead to this self-defeating cycle. So you have this round and round and round cycle that you have. You harbor these unrealistic ideas, they then trigger these emotions, and those emotions then lead back to these unrealistic ideas and beliefs. And it's this constant cycle that you go to. Now, we have what's called rational emotive behavior therapy. This therapy technique attempts to restructure a person's belief system into a more realistic, rational, and logical set of views. And it does so by challenging those dysfunctional beliefs that maintain the irrational behavior. So it's going to take place of that ABC model where you just constantly are going in this cycle. So this is a picture looking at that ABC model. And you can see this at the top of page 542 in your textbook. So the A is negative activating condition. Close relationship breaks up, right? You're in a close emotional relationship with someone, a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and that breakup activates a condition. The B is that you have this irrational belief system. I'll never be loved again. No one's going to love me the way this person loved me. I guess I'm just going to give up on love. And then the C is the emotional consequences of that. You feel a lot of anxiety, loneliness, sadness, and depression. So this is that ABC model. The A is the activating condition, the B is the irrational belief system, and the C is the emotional consequence that you find. One of the well-known researchers that we have when we think about these cognitive approaches to therapy is Aaron Beck. And he's the one that proposed CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy aims to change people's illogical thoughts about themselves and about the world. You also have cognitive appraisal. And this is where you ask a patient to evaluate a situation or to evaluate themselves and to evaluate others in terms of their memories, their values, their beliefs, thoughts, and expectations. So you have the patient evaluate these situations or themselves and others in terms of these situations. And then what the therapist does is it helps the client discover new ways of thinking that are much more appropriate than those negative ways of thinking. Now, the last slide in this module is evaluating cognitive approaches to therapy. We have both, again, benefits and criticisms to the cognitive approach. First off, for the benefits, it's a way to deal with a broad range of disorders. And therapists may incorporate additional treatment approaches. So it deals with a broad range of disorders, and the therapist may incorporate additional treatment approaches. The one criticism we have is that it changes one's assumptions to make them more reasonable and logical. And that may not always be helpful.